Picture a river that has been held hostage for over a century. A river that once thundered through the forests of Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, carrying the lifeblood of an entire ecosystem: salmon, gravel, nutrients, and the deep cultural memory of a people who have lived beside it for thousands of years. Now picture the day the chains finally come off. This is the story of the Elwha River, and what happened next is one of the most remarkable ecological recoveries ever documented on this planet. The Elwha River drains uninterrupted from a snowfield in the mountains of Washington's Olympic National Park to the Strait of Juan de Fuca in the Pacific Ocean. That sentence sounds simple, obvious even, but for the better part of a century, it wasn't true. For nearly 100 years, that journey was broken, cut in two by a pair of concrete walls that changed everything. And the story of how those walls came down and what happened when they did is one that scientists are still struggling to fully describe, because nature, it turns out, was just waiting for the door to open. Since time immemorial, the Elwha River had been home to 10 species of anadromous fish, primarily salmon and steelhead. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe fished the river and its estuary for at least 8,000 years. Think about what 8,000 years means. It means generation after generation of people whose entire culture, diet, ceremony, and identity was woven around the rhythm of salmon returning from the sea. The river wasn't just a resource, it was a relationship. The Elwha River is fed by several glaciers and perennial snowfields in the Olympic Mountains, and is home to salmon, lamprey, otters, and elk that have sustained indigenous peoples in the region since time immemorial. It was a complete interlocking system, each species feeding the next, the salmon carrying marine nutrients deep into the forest when they died, feeding the trees, the bears, the birds, the river bottom itself. And then, in the early 1900s, all of that was severed. In the early 1900s, 2 hydroelectric dams were constructed on the Elwha River in Washington State: the 32-meter-high Elwha Dam and the 64-meter-high Glines Canyon Dam. The Elwha Dam was completed first in 1913, built by a private power company to generate electricity for the growing industries of the Olympic Peninsula. When the dams were built between 1910 and 1927, it was actually illegal to block the passage of fish in the Washington Territory. However, dam supporters convinced the government and politicians to overlook the law, allow the dams to be built, and create hatcheries to replace the salmon. Let that sink in. The dams were built illegally. The promise of hatcheries was the political cover, and when those hatcheries failed, the Elwha Clallam people were simply left with a broken river and broken promises. Unlike many other dams in the Pacific Northwest, the dams on the Elwha River didn't include any fish passage to help salmon migrate upstream. Consequently, salmon populations returning from the sea to spawn had only 5 miles of habitat, a small fraction of the 145 miles of streamside habitat along the main stem and tributaries they previously had. 5 miles out of 145. Imagine being told you can only live in the hallway of a house that was once entirely yours. For over a century, these dams blocked anadromous fish from accessing over 90% of the watershed. The dams also blocked the natural delivery of sediment and wood to downstream habitats. The consequences radiated outward in every direction. Without sediment reaching the river delta, the beaches began to erode. Without salmon carcasses decomposing in the upper watershed, the forest lost its annual infusion of marine nutrients. The whole web began to fray. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe never accepted this. They never stopped fighting. Local, regional, and national stakeholders supported the tribe's motion to stop the relicensing of the dams, arguing that the dams prevented the tribe's ability to exercise their right to fish, since the dams illegally blocked fish passage. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe persistently lobbied Congress to meet the United States treaty obligations to the tribe, as outlined in the 1855 Treaty of Point No Point. Decade after decade, the tribe pushed. Scientists joined the cause, conservation groups rallied, and slowly the political math began to shift. Despite the U.S. Congress enabling dam removal and restoration with the passage of the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act of 1992, it took another 20 years to actually breach the dams and reconnect the river. 20 years of planning, funding battles, environmental reviews, and political maneuvering. But in September 2011, the excavators finally rolled in. Both dams were removed simultaneously over 3 years from 2011 to 2014, reopening more than 70 miles of pristine salmon habitat. Dam removals of such magnitude had never been undertaken before. At the time, it was the largest dam removal project in the history of the world. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. The actual demolition was not a clean or quiet process. Picture the river held back for a century, suddenly finding its old channels again. During the 3 years of dam removal, from September 2011 to August 2014, more than 10 million cubic meters of sediment was eroded from the former reservoirs, transported downstream, and deposited throughout the lower river delta, and nearshore waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The water ran brown, thick with a century of trapped earth. In the first few years following dam removal, sediment flushed from the former reservoirs in a muddy torrent, suppressing aquatic insect life and nearshore kelp beds for a short period of time. Scientists held their breath. Critics pointed to the turbid water and said this was proof the project was a mistake. But the scientists who had studied rivers for decades understood something the critics didn't. This was not destruction. This was a river clearing its throat. Because here is what nobody fully anticipated: how fast the river would remember. So much sediment, once trapped in reservoirs behind the two hydroelectric dams, flowed downstream that it dramatically reshaped the river's mouth, replenished eroding beaches, and created new habitat for marine creatures not observed there in years. Meanwhile, Chinook salmon and steelhead began streaming into stretches of the Elwha River and its tributaries previously blocked by the Elwha Dam, which had stood for nearly a century before it came down. The salmon didn't wait for an invitation. They didn't wait for the river to settle, for the scientists to finish their paperwork, or for anyone to give the all clear. The moment there was passage, they went. With the first dam gone, the ocean-migrating fish swam as far upriver as they could. Scientists observed them at the base of the second 210-foot-tall Glines Canyon Dam, about 13 miles upstream, as if they wanted to continue on, pressing against the wall, testing it, waiting. When Glines Canyon came down in 2014, they kept going. Initial responses by returning adult Chinook salmon and steelhead was an increase in the number and spatial extent of both natural and hatchery origin fish. The river delta was transforming too. Between 2011 and 2018, the Elwha River Delta increased by approximately 26.8 hectares, new beaches, new intertidal habitat. The shoreline was literally growing back, and it wasn't just fish. The former reservoir beds, once drowned under still water, coated in accumulated sediment, were now open ground. Nature moved in immediately. Deer, elk, beavers, and several species of birds and small mammals increasingly used the former reservoirs over the 3 years of study. By 2017, wildlife cameras were capturing something extraordinary. In what were once dead lake beds, you could now find black bears, skunks, minks, weasels, beavers, otters, bobcats, cougars, snowshoe hares, fishers, deer, elk, eagles, herons, American dippers, and plenty of amphibians. The food web was reassembling itself, bottom to top. As salmon and steelhead moved into areas previously blocked, they acted as a fertilizer for the ecosystem, delivering marine nutrients to river otters and other wildlife. Early results showed there had been an increase in marine nutrients in the river otters studied. They're taking up marine nutrients definitely and sooner than we expected, said Kim Sager-Fradkin, a wildlife biologist with the lower Elwha tribe. The birds noticed too. The tribe collaborated with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center to study the impact of dam removal on American dippers and other birds. We know that they're getting access to salmon, and we know there are potential benefits of that, said a researcher working on the study. When salmon first migrated upriver after the first dam was removed, the dippers keyed in on them right away and were observed gobbling up fish eggs as the salmon spawned. Think about what that image means. A tiny bird, no bigger than your fist, diving into a cold mountain stream to eat salmon eggs, eggs that hadn't been in that part of the river in 100 years. The dippers hadn't forgotten. Some deep biological programming, encoded over millennia, recognized the food source the moment it reappeared. The removal released an unbelievable 24 million cubic yards of sediment, equivalent to 8 football stadiums filled to the roof. That sediment, that ancient soil, became the raw material for new forests. Just a decade after dam removal, dense young forest, mostly deciduous, was already 6 to 10 meters tall. You could stand in what was once the bottom of a reservoir and look up at a canopy that didn't exist 10 years before. For the lower Elwha tribe, the recovery was never just an ecological story. It was a cultural and spiritual one. Healthy salmon spawned in the Elwha River had provided sustenance, cultural and spiritual value, and identity to the communities who depend on them. After the dams were built and when the hatcheries ultimately failed, the Elwha River no longer provided a strong ancestral connection between the forests, waters, fish, orcas, and people that it once did. For a century, the tribe fished what they could from a diminished river. Elders grew old watching the salmon runs that sustained their grandparents dwindle to a shadow. And then, after the dams came down, they waited again, this time by choice. They imposed their own moratorium on fishing, protecting the returning runs, giving the river time to rebuild. Patience, again, always patience. Then, in October 2023, the wait was finally over. On October 9, 2023, the tribe held a celebration on the banks of the Elwha with singing, dancing, and praying by the tribal community before officially opening the fishery. For the first time since the dams were removed in 2014, the lower Elwha tribe was able to open a ceremonial and subsistence salmon fishery. Approximately 621 coho had returned to the Elwha River, about 36% of which had spawned on their own rather than being born in a hatchery. The numbers were 10% higher than the year before, and it was the largest return of coho to the river in 4 years. Mike McHenry, the tribe's fish habitat manager, put it simply, "The fish are doing it on their own." McHenry had been working on the recovery of the Elwha River for 32 years. 32 years he had watched the dams go up on paper, watched the plans, the legal battles, the engineering, the demolition, and now he was watching wild coho salmon spawn in habitat that had been off limits to them for a century. Being able to share that fish onto our family tables again, that is something that is very humbling to elders as well as the tribal community. Scientists are careful to temper the celebration with honesty. Extensive monitoring conducted to date shows that removing the dams is positively benefiting Chinook salmon and steelhead populations and is improving the ecological condition of the river, though the recovery of these priority species will require decades to achieve historic levels of abundance. Full recovery was never going to happen in 10 years. The river was strangled for a century. Giving it a decade to rebuild is not a failure. It is the beginning. The data from the Elwha and from several other rivers where dams have been removed are consistent in their story. Restoring and improving connectivity benefits migratory fish species, mammals, birds, and insects. A connected river is good for nature, period. And because we are a part of and depend on nature, it is good for humanity too. The Elwha's lessons were not lost on the rest of the world. Today, the fish and wildlife are rebounding, and the Elwha restoration effort serves as the model for bringing rivers and their ecosystems back to life. When engineers and ecologists began planning the removal of 4 dams on the Klamath River, straddling the Oregon-California border, they looked to the Elwha as their template. That project, the Klamath River Renewal Project, became the world's largest dam removal effort. The $500 million project dismantled 4 hydroelectric dams along the 257-mile Klamath River. The dams, completed between 1918 and 1962, significantly altered the river's natural flow for more than a century, preventing threatened and endangered salmon and steelhead trout from reaching their spawning grounds. And when the last dam came down on the Klamath in 2024, the salmon didn't waste a moment. Within 10 days of completing the final in-water work at Iron Gate Dam, more than 6,000 Chinook salmon were observed migrating upstream into newly accessible habitat over a 2-week period. A sonar station recorded more than 9,600 fish crossing the historic threshold in the first season, with an estimated 7,700 of those being Chinook salmon. "The Klamath is showing us the way," said Barry McCovey Jr., director of the Yurok Tribal Fisheries Department. "The speed and scale of the river's recovery has exceeded our expectations and even the most optimistic scientific modeling, proving that when the barriers fall, nature has an incredible power to heal itself." When the barriers fall, that phrase is doing a lot of work, because what these rivers are teaching us in real time, in data that scientists can measure and tribes can feel, is that nature is not as fragile as we feared. It is not delicate. It is patient. It is persistent. It is waiting, always waiting for the door to open even a crack. The salmon hold the memory of rivers they have never swum. Something in their biology encodes the knowledge of where to go, handed down through generations that were blocked, rerouted, frustrated. The moment passage opens, they go. The moment the nutrients flow again, the otters notice. The moment the gravel is deposited, the dippers dive. The moment the sediment reaches the delta, the beach grows back. It is not magic. It is ecology. But from where we stand, watching a river that was dead for a century spring back to life, it is very hard to tell the difference.